Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today, and welcome to this week's episode of End of Growth to Prism. It's a live webcast where we discuss all facets of leadership, and the last several weeks, we've been discussing leadership in a crisis. We've gone through a lot of different topics over the last 5 or 6 weeks, from leadership attributes to how businesses pivot, the moral obligations of businesses during a crisis. And last week, we really got into the psychology of emerging from a crisis, things that leaders can do to help their employees gain confidence moving back into the business as the companies start to reopen during COVID. And we got into really the psychology of the individual who has to go back to work and what they may be going through from a stress standpoint. So that leads us into this week where we have a special guest that I'm going to let Jim Hotaling introduce. Stephen Robinson was recently on Jim Hotaling's Iron Sharpens Iron podcast, and we just thought it was a beautiful lead in to ask Stephen to join us today to continue our conversation. So, Jim?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. If you've not heard it, go to any one of the podcast supporting platforms and just dial in Iron Sharpens Iron Movement. And then you can find the episode that Stephen Robinson and myself talked for a good hour on really resilience and what it is all about in today's world. And based off of those conversations, I thought this would just be a great extension to bring Stephen back on here. And I'm happy to introduce him. You know, he's the founder and CEO of a company called Even Pulse, and he's created a scientifically proven methodology that helps improve performance. It lowers stress and anxiety. We talk about self-regulation of the stress response itself, and then gaining relief and recovery for better performance day to day for the individual. And it doesn't matter if you are a soldier or if you are a corporate executive or if you're on the front lines every single day on still dealing with the pandemic or being a first responder. This type of information that Stephen has and the discussion we'll have today is for you. So I think it's going to be a great hour for us today.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So, Stephen, welcome. I did look at your website, evenpulse.com, and it was fascinating. Many of us have been in the corporate world for decades, like myself, and have been through a lot of different crises. And I was at a publicly traded company that had tremendous pressure every quarter to meet all the numbers, to hit shareholder goals, etc. So I thought I'd seen a lot of stress in my life. But then when COVID came along, that was probably about the most amount of stress I've been through in a long time. I do have underlying health conditions, so I had to totally change my world. And then we have all the social justice issues and protests that just piled on right on top of that and really turned the country upside down. So I think stress is at a max level. And as you go through the information on your website, there's a lot of comments about resiliency and then the role stress plays in your life. And you actually go across multiple industries. You go across military, you go across professional sports. I noticed you were a professional tennis player for many years. You have an incredibly interesting background with all the things you've done in your life. How did a guy like you end up focusing on stress and resiliency? How did you get there?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that. It's been an interesting journey. I actually started my career in the tennis and fitness industry. So I was a professional tennis player, briefly coached for many years, but I was also fascinated by and had actually engaged in studying special operations. So I was originally recruited by both DOD and by a government intelligence agency to study those issues. And what I found that crossed over between those two worlds is the ability to really navigate and master stress and handle oneself internally is a great predictor of how you're going to basically meet whatever shows up. And so I became fascinated by that on both fronts, and that became part of the basis of what we designed as our training programs.
Awesome. So, so what you're saying then basically is that if you can make people more resilient, let them handle stress better, obviously, pretty intuitive, you're going to get better performance, the people are going to be more focused, less distracted, et cetera, et cetera. So let's kind of dive into this crisis a little bit. And last week we were talking about the psychology of the individual, whether that was the leader who had to use now an online persona through video, and that leader has to reduce uncertainty, reduce stress, create confidence, have credibility to create that confidence in the workforce as they move back into the public sector as businesses reopen. So if you were to get hired today by somebody in corporate America and with a big workforce, and they said, help me with my employees, what would be some of the techniques you'd deploy to help those employees gain resiliency, reduce that stress?
Well, the first thing I'd suggest is work with your own stress. So for the leader, him or herself, really mastering our own response is a key, because you're modeling whatever that behavior and that way of handling what shows up in your life to everybody else around you. So if you're sleeping well and you're working with your own stress response and you have a strategy of how you're approaching this, it's going to make a big difference in what you show everyone else.
So saying things like if you're sleeping well, et cetera, there may be people that already have natural resiliency, or they've built it up, they've maybe taken your training. But if you got a leader who's not sleeping well, who's having weird COVID dreams, as they call them, and things like that, what can that leader do individually to get themselves in a position where they can now start stepping up for their employees and gaining that credibility and confidence as a leader, particularly online? It's very hard to project on virtually versus having people in the room with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that we all can learn around this is what's within our locus of control and what's not. And I think a great leader is going to look at his or her own internal environment and recognize, hey, we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, a VUCA world. And I think COVID and the recent protests and what have you have also accelerated that. But if you look at, honestly, what are the things that are inside my locus of control? What can I concentrate on that I can do things about? That's a great starting point. In fact, I encourage people to do an exercise where you draw a circle and write down all the things that you know are absolutely outside of your sphere of influence. And then what are the things that you can control, and put those things inside your circle. That's a great starting point.
Totally get that. I think that's spot on. And then as you're putting all those things inside your circle and you kind of check the box, and then if you write things outside of the circle that aren't in your locus of control, and one or two of those things is kind of critical to success, and personally I could be getting stressed out about that because now I have something that I really need to be successful that I don't have control over. What would you recommend? How would you handle those items, the stuff outside the circle?
Well, I think this is an intrinsic problem for anybody in a leadership position, because there are things that are outside of your control that you're still wanting to influence or at least have a relationship with. The success of your business, while you could say, well, there's so much riding on me in terms of what I do, there's still a lot of what we call exogenous factors, things that are outside of us that can determine things that are not necessarily going to play out the way we expect. So, I think if you can honestly appraise what is inside the locus. Okay, just for example, right now, I'm going to my breath. So I take that full deep inhale. Nobody can change that unless they're pressing down on me, keeping me from breathing. So I'm focused on that because that's something I can do something about. And for that matter, also my attention. What do I put my attention on? How am I parsing that attention carefully so that I can focus on things that are empowering me versus things that are disempowering? And the list goes on and on. I mean, we teach about 20 to 25 skills in our training, but I think there are a lot of different tools people can use at this time, or really any time, to master their own internal response.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I don't want to hog the airtime here, guys. So jump in with Jim and Joe and Vera.
No, I would say that this is the big stomping point that we have to have for these conversations to move forward, is that the responsibility starts first with the leader themselves. This is a leadership, conversation that we're having, and you can look out the window and blame everybody else, but it all starts with looking at the mirror, at yourself first, and saying what I can control. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, that is the baseline of this entire discussion. And so I find it refreshing, because it is, even in a virtual world, we can look across at each other and go, what are you doing for yourself first? And it's not a selfish maneuver. I think this is one of the things we talked about in the podcast, Stephen, was this isn't a selfish thing to think about when you say, I've got to take care of myself first, right? That's not selfish. You're actually doing this for others too when you do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you think of it as like a parent with a child, if we're taking care of ourselves, we're going to be better parents, better able to take care of others. It's kind of hard to get from.
this isn't flipping a switch, obviously. You can't just say, I'm going to write a bunch of things inside a circle and I'm going to practice deep breathing and stuff. So, how do you do it iteratively? How do you know you're making progress? Is it the fact that you are sleeping better, that you are more focused? And what signs can you look for, signals can you look for as a leader that these methods you're talking about are actually working?
Well, the first and foremost thing I look for is how does one feel in the body? So do you feel comfortable? Do you feel relaxed? Do you feel present? Do you feel a subtle sort of niggling anxiety? And I think a lot of us do feel that on a day-to-day basis. And a great leader could say, honestly, as an appraisal, it's like, hey, I feel some anxiety too. And these are the things that I do to self-regulate.
That's a great point, because it's a great part of being genuine when leaders can kind of acknowledge to their team that they're human too, that they're feeling the same things that their teams are feeling. So I think that's an awesome point. Joe, Vera?
Yes, I have a question and a comment. So, with respect to what Stephen and Jim said, I absolutely agree. And I think that in times of crisis, many companies actually talking about, cycle resilient businesses, talking about investing or, let's say, dedicating their time to business units which are less subject to seasonal or like crisis fluctuations. But essentially, it's not about this external perspective. It's really about the internal perspective, and really the way to focus on operational improvement in order not to adapt yourself, creating cycle resilient business concepts, but really adapting your teams and training your teams in order to become resilient and more flexible, maybe to adapt to what's going on in the market or in the world. Because what we are seeing right now with this COVID crisis, of course, it's very unexpected, and it's very harsh and has affected many economies in the world. But essentially, I think one has to be prepared to all kind of situations, and this is the resilience you have to develop in yourself and in teams. And my question would be, because for me it's always interesting to make parallels between business and sports, and I think that Stephen, you can agree that there's a great deal of resiliency lessons we can learn from sports. And there's one interesting concept that I think I've learned. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, because I was born in the north, and I think that for many years my favorite sport was cross-country skiing, and then I was running marathons. So in endurance sports, there is this concept which I think in English it's called it's not the second breath, let me tell it to you, it's a second wind.
Second
the
wind, yes.
concept of the second wind, right? That first of all you feel that it's very hard and maybe it doesn't make any sense, and then you're making an effort, and then you reach the point where you start enjoying this effort, enjoying the hardness of like maybe seeing your target that is closer to you. And like it's really a phenomenon, because I think that there is like a physiological part in this concept of the second wind, but I think that again it's very closely related to the psychology of a person, and to his perception of really making an extra effort and going an extra mile, because the satisfaction from reaching the objective would be twice as much as if you didn't do it, or did something which is smaller and maybe requires less effort. So what's your view on this, and what are the resiliency efforts we can learn from sports?
Well, that's a great comment, and I appreciate the insights, especially around cross-country skiing, and whether you're shooting biathlon or you're doing anything that requires this really hard push towards our limits and our edges. I think that's a lot of what we're going through around COVID, and the opportunity through this is to actually become much more resilient. Because I think, when we hit those edges, and what you're talking about when we get the second win, is we break through this plateau whereby our body and our brain is really screaming for us to stop, because we've pushed to this limit and this edge. But then there's also a transcendent point in which you do get that second win. You've broken through a level. And whether we think that is more of spiritual or existential or mental or psychological, it doesn't really matter. It's that we've transcended what we thought were our limits. And the studies that I did of special operators years ago, I found most of those people were extraordinary at being able to push beyond what most people would consider a limit or a cap. This is how far I can go. And going through that discomfort and saying the prize of what I am intending to do is here, and no matter what, I'm going to go to that place. It's a natural proclivity among that population, but it's also a drive. And I think a lot of that can be learned if one recognizes that sometimes going through discomfort is going to get you to a much deeper place of integration and connection.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
That's a really interesting concept. So, kind of a little sidebar question, Stephen. Do you feel like today a lot of companies, or maybe even society itself, is kind of lowering those upper limits to reduce the stress so people don't reach and don't overachieve as much as they used to? Or do you feel like we're kind of in the same place we've always been? Personally, kind of set you up a little bit here. Personally, I think in a lot of instances, you talk about the stereotypical millennial, which I know they hate being talked about that way, but always talking about everybody gets a trophy and how everything's changed. And I've listened to Marcus Buckingham speak several times where he's talked about the impact on his kids, where everybody gets a ribbon, everybody gets this, everybody gets that. So, based on what you just said, that's kind of lowering that ceiling, so people will get a reduction in stress because they don't have to stretch as far. So do you feel that's actually happening, or am I kind of overreaching here?
Yeah, it's interesting that you frame it that way. I think obviously things have changed in our culture over the years. We grew up in an era where you came in first, second, or third, and there weren't participation trophies or what have you. But at the same time, I think, ultimately what I'm driving at is everything that we do is a practice, and what we practice, we get better at. And so, I can't just snap my fingers and teach you how to breathe deeply and diaphragmatically all the time, and nor can you do that to yourself unless you practice doing it. Mm-hmm. And so, in many ways, I don't know whether we've lowered the bar in terms of our relationship to stress or achieving, but I know personally for me as a leader, I've stopped striving nearly as much. And in my stopping of my striving, I've actually become much more successful because I'm more relaxed, more present, more connected to my team, more integrated inside myself. So, yeah, I don't know if I can cast a larger wrap of what I think is going on in the culture, but I do think each one of us has an opportunity in this time to step into a deeper place of connection.
Yeah, it sounds like to me there's like two levels. There's becoming resilient to the level you're living at, your own current ecosystem. But then when you just talked about that second level, or Vera talking about getting that second wind, you can actually, once you reach that first order of becoming resilient within your current state, you can actually stretch that up, is what you're saying. You can take that to another level and raise the ceiling higher, so to speak, and become even more resilient. So it's very interesting concepts. And just one sidebar. So I noticed Jacqueline joined us again. She's been with us, I think, every week since the first show. And thank you very much. She was kind of reinforcing the point that leaders have to step up first. And I'm glad you're on the show with us again, Jacqueline. Thank you for joining us.
Something I think is an interesting point too that's been brought up is that when we're coaching other senior executives, one of the things that many fail to realize that if you need to move the needle between a peer that is in your competitive market space, one of the things that you can do is embrace this form of resiliency, is to take care of yourself. If you are equal against your competitive peer in education, training, and experiences, what is the one thing that can change the way that you will think and act and be every single day on the job? And these are some of the techniques, some of the mindsets that you have to be successful today to move that needle. And it's not going and getting another education. It's not anything like that. It's taking care of yourself.
Okay, so let's go back to the individual again. So, we've discussed leadership, and the leader has to take care of themselves first, and then, they can't take care of their people unless they're in a good place themselves. So let's go back to those people again. And what I'm really interested in is the individual. And we're sitting here in Massachusetts, and we're in what's called phase 2A, where restaurants can start serving outside. They can't serve inside yet. And some of the retail stores can be open by appointment and things like that. Still pretty restrictive, but I know a lot of people that have been home for 10 plus weeks, and they're not sure they're ready to go back in that work environment. but they don't have a choice. So when you talk about that locus of control circle, they need money, and that so they do have the ability to stay at home. They could say, I'm going to not pay my mortgage, or I'm not going to pay my rent, I'm not going to buy food. So that is their control point. But in reality, that I have to go to work is kind of outside that circle, and that's creating a lot of stress because they don't feel like that's in their control. So what would we recommend for people in that situation? How can they get themselves in a place where, I know there's tactical stuff you can do around personal protective equipment and things like that, but they're still going to feel that anxiety. And I know a person who's had to go back to work as a hairdresser because her unemployment wouldn't stay. She was offered her job back, so she had no choice. Her unemployment was going to end. And she walks into that door every day, even with PPE on, and she just doesn't feel good. A lot of stress and anxiety. So what can we do in cases like that with the individual?
Yeah, I think the larger wrap of this is that the whole environment has presented us with an opportunity to look at our fears, fears of the unknown, fears of uncertainty. Honestly, we're surrounded by viruses, bacteria, all sorts of pathogens. So day to day, we always have some level of exposure. What I encourage people to do is to really look at their inner shield. We can, yes, obviously put on our PPEs and create an external shield as best we can. But what is your internal shield for being able to maintain your health? How are you maintaining your gut biome? How are you working with your own stress levels? How well are you sleeping? So when I say that, I mean coming up with a sleep strategy of between 7.5 and 9 hours a night. Some of us get 6. Da Vinci and Edison seem to function fine on 4, but they also took naps during the day. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that, each one of us has an opportunity to work with our own internal environment so we can actually build up our immunity. Are you getting adequate levels of vitamin D? Are you getting out in the sunshine? And then also looking at the data that says, okay, what honestly is my risk here? And as long as I'm doing certain things, can I knock down that risk to the point that I feel at least good enough about having to go do that? And it is a time where I think a lot of us are having to make hard choices. A lot of people in business, a lot of people at an individual level.
Makes sense. All right, Joe, you're up.
Steve, you have so many interesting things to say, and I think I can sit with you probably for days on end and just ask a million questions. But what I would love to know is, and I think a lot of leaders would like to know, because I think folks who are leading either large teams or a lot of individuals in general will say they don't have time. I don't have time for this. My question to you is, what do you hear as the most common excuse for folks? Because I would love for folks who are watching to understand that it is possible to work on yourself. I think a lot of folks do see it as being selfish and not selfless, but selfish, but also I just don't have time. I don't have time to do this right now. I gotta focus on so many other things. I can't focus on doing this. But what is the big? Is that one of the biggest excuses you hear? And then how do you get those types of folks or who are thinking that way to just overcome that? Is it just by small bits at a time? Like, what is your philosophy there?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, that when you look at personal growth or strategies for self-regulation, they do take some time to learn. Like a conventional mindfulness course is about a 27-hour program. One of the reasons we built a very short, compact approach to training is, first, we were required to do it by the military. They said, you've got 4 hours to be able to impart resilience. We actually started with saying we wanted 2 days, and the 2-star general said, you've got 2 hours. We negotiated 4. So that's how we arrived at a short, kind of compact, hard-hitting model. But my point of focus is, what can you do on the fly? So, and this is where I think leaders can take a lot of things away from this. You don't have to necessarily go sit on the beach for 2 weeks to learn about de-stressing. You don't have to necessarily take an extended course to learn ideas about resilience that are practical. It's what are the things you're doing along the way. Like every time my phone rings and before I pick it up, I'll cycle my breath once. Just doing that one thing over and over. And how many times does my phone ring a day? Or if I connect that to the chimes on my computer when I got another text message or an email, I cycle it once. Well, that might go off 78 to 200 times a day. Who knows how many, but a lot. But every time I'm doing that, I'm connecting it to something that I already hear and engage with. Therefore, I've just practiced 70 to 200 times of breathing a day. Boom.
Interesting.
And Joe, just to add on to that, one of the things I took Stephen's training method when I was still in the military, and one of the things that was the most beneficial to me was these cleansing breaths, just 3 good cleansing breaths before I would get into a stressful situation. And I do that to this day. Like when I sit down at the computer before, like as the computer's turning on after you type in your password and it's all kind of jinking up, I close my eyes and take those 3 cleansing breaths, and I just clear my thoughts out. I'd be sitting at that computer anyways. I'd be waiting for it all to come up. And by just doing those things, it start to regulate my stress for the day and all of those things. And it centers me. And it's those simple techniques that I think you just integrate throughout the day can make a big difference.
That's really interesting. How much do you, Steve, how much do you see emotional intelligence having an impact on one's ability to be resilient or not to be resilient?
Yeah, I certainly think that's a huge part of resilience, is understanding oneself as an emotional being, because we all have emotions. We have emotional responses to things. And I just want to give you an example, and this will tie together the EI piece, emotional intelligence, with what Jim was just talking about, which is when you have stressful news or you're having a stress response. And I mean, that usually shows up as an emotional response. We feel anxiety. We feel maybe some tightness in our chest. We feel like something's pressing down on us. One of the best skills you can use is to extend your exhale. So I want to encourage all you guys to try this. Anytime stressful information, something you have a stress response to, and you notice this in your body, because that's the best way to become more emotionally intelligent, is pay attention to how is my body responding. You might even think of emotions as the body's response to the mind. And you extend that exhale. What that does is a couple of things. One is, by extending your exhale, it slows the nervous system down, because it brings the parasympathetic side of your nervous system online. The next thing it does is it balances out the stress response. So rather than us accelerating and moving into a fight flight, which requires a lot of sympathetic nervous system energy, we're toning that down and taking the edge off. The next thing it does is it puts something within your locus of control, because as long as you're taking that exhale, as you breathe, it's also going to force you to take a more natural, deep inhale in response. So you begin to balance it out. Just one of many things that you can do.
It's really interesting. Ah, that's good. Thank you.
Oh, that's
welcome.
cool. I've just been extending my exhale when we're talking, and you can can feel it right away. That's fascinating.
Well, and you're pushing that stale air out of your lungs. And Vera, obviously, from being an endurance athlete, as we're cycling oxygen, that is a big part of how we engage with our environment. We're working on an aerobic basis.
Absolutely.
And many of us don't really pay any attention to it because we do it automatically. And so somebody says, "Oh, take a deep breath," and you're like, you just want to give that person the hand. But what I encourage people to do is put on your own oxygen mask first before attempting to help others. Mm-hmm. So by doing that, as you extend that exhale, you're again going to your locus of control, but you're doing something that is so fundamental that tames the stress response.
Yeah,
Very
it's
cool.
amazing because essentially it's really about coming back to basics, because sometimes, especially in situations of extreme stress, we're trying to look for sophisticated solutions, but essentially it's really hearing yourself and getting this internal perspective of what's happening in your body and how is it connected to your mind and emotions. And answers, they seem to be simple, so hopefully everyone will be aware of it, and it's really amazing how it works. And I agree with the sport philosophy, and with also a step-by-step progress that you're making if you would like to achieve a certain sport or life objectives. So it's really the question of small steps, and really also about enjoying the process itself, because I think that the resilience as a concept, it's largely related to our expectations. So the question is what are the expectations? Reaching the objective, which maybe was not just defined in the right way without taking into account all the external circumstances and the flexibility one has to have, when starting a business project, or really enjoying the process, and again taking this breath at every step you take, and realizing the progress and the benefits of each single small achievement.
Yep. Hey Jim, so what's the three? You said there were three breaths that you take.
Yeah, cleansing breaths. But maybe Stephen wants to
What is the three
work
cleansing
us through a
breath?
breathing exercise because there's several
Yeah.
different breathing techniques. And Vera, to your point, when you're talking about how it gets so simple again, the beautiful part about this is all primal, right? This is the caveman or woman body that still exists within us. Stephen's just been able to do 20 to 30 years worth of scientific study and research and validation on to figure out, this is what really works from the primal levels and stuff. And I think this breathing technique that he'll talk about, because he's got a couple, Joe, whichever one you want to show on us there, Stephen, you'll just instantly see because it goes all the way back to our primal bodies.
Yeah, and before I take you guys through the technique, what I want to encourage you to do is look at this. The vagus nerve, which is a tenth of the cranial nerves, actually governs our relaxation response. It's hardwired in through our face, and so a lot of how we attune to other human beings and what tells us if we're safe or if we perceive we're not has to do with facial attunement. This comes from polyvagal theory, which I find fascinating. We teach that to all of our trainers and have them really tap into, I want to turn on my vagus nerve. Because as I always say, what happens in the Vegas doesn't stay in the Vegas. So really hacking your Vegas is a big part of what we're teaching, because if you feel stressed or you feel nervous or you feel tense, your face will communicate that. And so a good leader knows how to project confidence, but coming from not a faux place or a put on confidence, but a deep sense of confidence based on, hey, I feel hooked up inside myself. And the vagus really modulates that. And so the science shows us that full deep breathing, and I'll teach you maybe two different techniques, actually turns on the vagus to the point we feel relaxed, present, and connected inside of ourselves. So the first one I want to practice with you guys is just extending the exhale. So as you take a full deep breath, if you can, in through your nose, then just purse your lips just slightly and extend the exhale. So you should be able to push that breath out 2, 3, 4, 5 times as long as the inhale. And did you notice that you had more control over the exhale? Mm-hmm. And especially by pursing the lips, you create a little back pressure, and it actually gives you more of a sense of regulation. And again, that's bringing the parasympathetic or the slow down side of your nervous system online. So that's one of many. And there are tons of breathing techniques. There's the box breath. There are all sorts of different types of breathing techniques. The bottom line is that bringing that awareness inside and taking control over it and influencing it takes us out of this kind of automatic stress response where we tend to breathe shallowly and with the upper third of the lungs. And guess what? The way the lungs work is that we have a lot of perfusion that takes that oxygen into our internal organs and our muscles, but a lot of the array of the capillaries is actually at the bottom of the lungs. Sure, there are capillaries everywhere in the lungs, but we have a very rich, dense number of capillaries that work at the bottom. So those alveoli help take that oxygen up. And if we're not getting the oxygen all the way down there, we're actually depriving our brain, our neocortex, which will go offline under stress when we feel a stress response, and we actually think less clearly. We're actually less functional physiologically. So let's just do one more breath. And this next one, I just want you to try to pace and count about an even number of breaths. So if you inhale for, say, a count of 3, then pause. I want you to exhale for a count of 3. Ready? Pause. And just cycle that a couple times at your own pace. 3 count, 4 count, 5 count, whatever works for you. That depends on the tidal volume of your lungs. And just notice how you feel in your body by breathing like that. Now, for some of you guys, you might be really tuned into that and do it a lot. For others, it might feel kind of alien, like, wow, I'm not used to practicing breathing. Maybe I feel a little lightheaded or it feels weird to me. So what I want to encourage you is to find places during the day where you can just take these momentary pauses and just tune into your breath, even just for a moment. Over time, you're going to begin to build this like a bank account. And it'll become automatic that you are regulating the stress response. And to your question, Joe, about leaders practicing things on the fly, this is something you can do constantly. Nobody needs to know you're doing it. It's not like, hey, I got to put on my special Batman breath here. Hold on. It's like you just do that as a natural response to whatever comes in, information, stimulus of any kind.
And Joe,
Thank you.
I'd like to share with all of us here, by learning this from Stephen in the past, I've already told you right before I start work, I do that, right, to be prepared and centered for work. But because we're all working out of our home offices now and things like that, I actually do it before I get up out of my chair and step out of my office and go back into my private life, right? Whether it's kids running around or the wife or the dog or anything like that. I actually take it so that I leave what I've built up as stress while I'm working. I leave it right there at the desk, and that centers me, and I go. And I will tell you, it makes a world of difference. The other thing too is it's a conditioning sequence. Stephen, I think even one of the classes that I sat in on with you, you were teaching law enforcement, and you said as they get in their vehicle to go on shift work in the morning, right? As they sit in their car before they even turn that ignition, go through a breathing exercise. And then when you turn it off and you're disconnecting from that law enforcement environment and coming back into the house, you do it again. And that's where I kind of stole that technique. And it works fabulous, really does.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating because, before the show, I would have been a little bit skeptical about this, but, just doing this for the last couple minutes and you can physically feel the difference when you do the breathing exercise. It's like an immediate change that you can feel in terms of the way your body's responding to the breathing exercises. And I remember Japanese companies, and I dealt a lot with Japanese companies back in the 70s and early 80s, is when in the morning they used to get the whole team together to do calisthenics before the start of the workday. And, part of that would be breathing too. And I'm thinking of a world now where you have all hands meetings and the leader can kick off the meeting by doing breathing exercises and just getting people used to getting a little bit more relaxed before they start and, get into a work environment or stressful conversation. This is really incredible. It's a fascinating concept.
Yeah, let me just share one other tool with you guys I think is useful. This is another power tool, and that's appreciation. So if we genuinely feel appreciative, whether it's of others' points of view, as difficult as that might seem sometimes, or appreciative that we've got our health or a roof over our head, or it's a beautiful sunny day outside, or practically anything, that actually begins to regulate our heart rate variability. And HRV, or heart rate variability, is a really good litmus test for our stress response. So how well we are well regulated. You'll see people who have a great ability to regulate stress usually have high heart rate variability. People who are not so good at regulating their stress will usually have low HRV. And so that full deep breathing does that, but also generally thinking more positively and appreciation are really powerful tools to regulate your HRV.
And Stephen, isn't it true that there's real data that backs up that's contagious in a way? Like your heart rate as a leader or as a fellow human can be detected within a certain range of another human, and it actually affects those humans?
Yeah, there's some science that suggests that about 8 to 12 feet of distance we tend to attune to or attenuate our heart rate variability to others. And what I'd encourage you to do is just think about, who have you been around who's really dysregulated? And is it easy to be around that person? And we know instinctively and intuitively what that answer is, right? And then on the converse, the person who is calm, poised, confident, integrated, centered, even if we can't look scientifically inside them to know that's the case, we can feel that's the case because they exude it. And that's what I see in being around great leaders. They're self-regulated. It's not put on. They are actually self-regulated. Mm-hmm. And if they are trying to put something on, they're going to be compromised eventually because the nervous system's not built to maintain a dysregulated state internally.
Interesting.
I think that's so cool.
That's really cool. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that you could actually sense that. So thanks for bringing that up, Jay. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and just see if you notice it the next time you're around somebody who's really losing it, or you just detect they feel dysregulated. We pick up a lot through people's faces, and the vagus nerve modulates that because it's wired in right through here. And like, for example, if somebody's getting too worked up in conversation, their vagus begins to turn off because it actually is wired through the voice box as well, which is why it's hard to hear people communicating well when they're in a stress response and they're dysregulated.
Stephen, as getting back to leadership again, and basically the ability to read the room, and looking either through U.S. corporate culture, or Vera joins us from France, and we last week were talking a little bit about things in Europe. During your studies, have you found that your methodology is universal across age groups, country, culture, or do you have to adapt and adjust certain things based on where you are in the world and the band of generations you may be talking to? Is it different, or do you think it's universal?
Well, I think in the sense that we're all human beings and organisms, just back to Jim's point about caveman days, that is really the hardwiring of who we are. We certainly are able to put on cultural masks and maybe hide things in certain cultures in certain ways that other cultures might not. But I think fundamentally what is in us as a human being are really these hardwired systems. We can't escape that we have a vagus nerve. We've all got one. Unless you have a vagotomy and your vagus nerve gets cut off. But realistically, this is how we're hardwired. So yes, I think anybody can learn these things and have a greater relationship with the people on their staff, with the people inside their own team, just by understanding themselves, because we're reflections of each other. I think of everybody as a mirror of self-reflection of other human beings.
Okay, awesome. Now, I was kind of thinking back to all my trips to Italy and how laid back that culture is, and no problem, we'll take care of it, no problem, we'll take care of it, versus kind of America where we get torqued up about things a little bit culturally, and so I didn't know if there was adjustments you had to make based on things like that, but it sounds like, a human being's a human being, and it all works the same.
Well, I think you're hitting on a cultural piece. It is true. I mean, Vera, you certainly see this in parts of France, especially in the South. I played a lot of tournaments in France years ago. But Italian culture, Spanish culture, there is, more of a laid backness. And certainly in the West and in the US, we have what I would consider a more sympathetically dominant culture, meaning our sympathetic nervous system, because of our striving and achieving and pushing, is more accelerated. So I think how you message and how you work with a type of culture is partly based on understanding the nuances of how are people operating inside themselves and engaging this more fundamental aspect of who they are.
Right. It's very interesting what you see, because I don't even know if I agree 100%, because I'm living now in France, and I'm coming from a northern culture, from Russia, but I also lived in Spain and in South America. So for me, the fact of being laid back and it's a little bit more relaxed when we speak about Spain, Italy, and southern countries, it's not necessarily related to the stress resilience of a person. Because, for example, living in Spain and working actually in executive search and recruitment, I've learned for the first time the term which is like, it's a nervous type. And then I was thinking, like, why? And there was really a nervous type of a person identified in the culture, identified in in the society. And I think that even though a person can be very relaxed, very laid back, this Southern Latin culture, it really facilitates, it facilitates this increased stress level in people, because very often you talk to a person and he's speaking very fast, and his ideas can be disorganized. So I think that it can be cultural, and again, like, of course, it stays within yourself. And I absolutely agree that the question of self-control, resilience, it's very universal. But sometimes certain external circumstances, they form your personality and just influence in a different way on how you react to the situation. And the same very way, for example, if we speak about Europe, a developed economy, right, and developing countries, sometimes the fact of having a very protective system, I think that it relaxes you in a way that when you have an extreme situation, your resilience levels are very low, because you always rely on something else, on something external that would possibly protect you. And then when you speak, for example, for people that coming from countries where they have less social protection, and the entire economic cycle is less predictable, and you are born in a way as a fighter, it's not that they're more resilient, but I think that they've learned to apply their resilience at the early stages, because they have to do it every day. So it's a very interesting topic to really see how it reflects in different cultures, and what are the methods to apply there.
Yeah, you're making a great point, and I don't mean to paint Southern European cultures as naturally resilient because they're more laid back per se. They're nervous and stressed out people everywhere,
Yeah.
and this is just the truth. But I guess one of the things I look at, I always kind of view the human being against the backdrop of our nervous system, and how are we operating in an optimal way that helps us get things done in the way we want to or within our organizational structure and makes us as effective as possible. So, one thing I think we have to learn from some of the Southern European cultures is to be a little bit more laid back and relaxed in our approach to life, and maybe just taking a little bit of an edge off. And I'm saying this as someone who lives inside of a hard-charging North American culture that really prizes excellence and, moving towards achievement and so on. So it's like the old joke, the guy goes to the psych, and the psych says, you're a type A personality. And the guy says, well, what should I do about that, doc? And the doctor says, I think you should take on some more type B qualities and be a little bit more laid back and, a little more detached. Just take it easy. And he says, I'm going to take that to heart. I'm going to become the best type B there's ever been.
I get that. Yes.
You get that joke?
Yes, I get it. So, Stephen, there's two things I'd like to, I can envision this global audience that's watching us right now just still writing down tips and tricks and all those kind of things. And there's two that I'd like to hit on. One, Mike brought up, in the fact that people are still afraid to potentially go back to work, and maybe today's their first day or next week they've just announced they're going back to work. I know you're a big believer in simulation also. Could you talk to us a little bit about what someone could do, in the lanes of simulation to think about a positive way to go back to work?
Yeah, one of the things that we teach and emphasize, and this comes from years of studying both special operators, athletes, many other people in high performance professions, is to pre-simulate or rehearse yourself being inside whatever that event or situation is, in which you're composed, you're handling yourself well, you've done everything possible to take your PPEs and put those in place, but you've also worked with your own internal response. How do you show up in relationship to you inside this milieu, inside this environment? And I think the more you can essentially simulate or put yourself in that place before you've gotten there, the more your brain and nervous system will be prepared for it.
And there's very little difference that your brain knows between simulation and real world, correct? I think that Dr. Grossman does a lot of work on that, about how video games are really making the society more violent because the brain doesn't know much of a difference between simulation and real.
Yeah, the brain can't easily distinguish between imagination and reality. So as we practice anything that you're worrying about, anything you're visualizing, simulating inside your own head shed, you're actually creating responses to that. Neurochemicals are being released in response to what you're imagining, what you're seeing in your mind's eye, and the body has to respond to it because we're built in that way. And so the more you take control over and begin to influence, what am I putting my attention on? What am I truly simulating, creating that as if inside my own mind? You can prepare yourself really well for whatever might show up, or you can actually put yourself on a slippery slope by the same token.
I think that's awesome.
So, Stephen, how early in life can things like this start? Is this things that, resiliency, is this something that we could have in the education system with, first, second, third graders, or is it better suited later in life? And, when is it appropriate?
Well, I'll just give you an example. Years ago, my mom was teaching second grade, and she had to go out. She was on a sick leave for a couple of days and had some surgery or something. Anyway, she asked me to be her substitute teacher, and I was on the substitute teacher roster for her county. And so I was actually in graduate school at the time at University of Richmond in Virginia. And I said, sure, I'll take your class. And so I was like, so by the end of the couple of days, I had all the kids doing these breathing and relaxation exercises. They were doing mind journeys. But I still taught the whole curriculum that she left for me, but I put all these things into place. And she got back and she said, my class was so calm. What did you do to them?
That's great.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
This is incredible from, not only a cause and effect standpoint of what it can do, but even the potential. I'm even fascinated with what you said with the simulation exercises and, all the talk about social injustice and what we can do about it, and how, racism isn't, you're not born with it, you're taught it. We can unteach it. We can also start early in terms of using simulations and things like you talked about to avoid, children learning about racism or learning to be racist. They should learn about racism. Um, I just think there's incredible potential with a lot of this stuff, and I know you've already been pretty successful with everything you've done with it, but I'm just fascinated by the whole concept and where it can go.
Yeah, well, I think we have an opportunity to learn a lot about ourselves through the grist of these things that have shown up, whether it's COVID or what happened with George Floyd. There's a really deep, rich opportunity for us to grow as human beings and evaluate everything that has come before us, because I think a lot of what we get governed by is our upbringing. I call it the little red wagon that we're all pulling, and it's right behind us. You turn around and look over your shoulder, oh, there it is. And it ends up showing up in our behaviors and our thoughts, in how we see the world. There's so much of that governing factor of how we've grown up. But guess what? We can change those things. Our brains are intimately plastic. They're neuroplastic. They can be changed. And so we have the ability to do that. And it really comes only through practice and by beginning to interrupt patterns of how the synapses are firing in our brains. It says, this is the construct of how the world is, or this is the way I see it or behave. Those can be changed. And the more we practice, the more we can prune away connections that we don't want.
So, in terms of your methodology, how do you reinforce sustainability? So I look at, getting into U.S. culture again, but I've always said that over the last 10 years, the whole country has developed ADD. It's just one shiny penny to the next. And one of the things I'm most worried about with the George Floyd situation and the social justice injustice isn't the passion that people are showing and isn't what they want to accomplish. And I heard many people say over the last 2 weeks that this is making them want to be a better human being, etc. But we don't do a good job at sustaining that thought. We tend to get onto something and then 2 weeks later is the next shiny penny. So how do we get that institutionalized inside of us to make things sustainable?
Well, one of the things I suggest is practice withdrawing your attention. Now, I know for busy leaders, wait a minute, I can't withdraw my attention from the company or from all the vagaries of what I have to do during the day. But what I'm getting at is information that's not necessarily useful at any given point in time. How can you pull back from that a little bit? Even if it's just walking outside for a minute or 2 minutes, taking a couple of slow, deep breaths and just dropping your weight into your feet and becoming present to your own body. The more we do that, the more we actually begin to master control of our attention response. And what you're getting at, I think, around the ADD thing is, I think we actually have trained our minds and brains to be less focused and less able to stay on a given skill or task. Mm-hmm. And much of what I think you're getting at is that being able to sustain that is a practice. And that starts with our own practices inside of what am I doing to self-regulate.
And I think, awesome. Stephen, one of the nice things is the methodology that Mike was asking about that you teach. This is where some of that data came from, right? Was the ability that once taught this kind of simple methodology, the stickiness or the ability to sustain it was proven because the model is pretty simple. And then, this was done in a very large, I think it was a military context, right? Where you got most of the long-term study from. And it shows that it does stick.
We trained about 6,000 soldiers who were deploying to Afghanistan and redeploying, and also soldiers coming back from Iraq. And what we found was that a year later, about 70% of the soldiers were still practicing the skills regularly, and that was from one single 4-hour block of instruction. So it's stuck with them, and part of our success is we help them connect it to what they do. Because, even though we often say, are you a human doer or a human being? You look at this kind of schism between those two worlds. The fact is we do a lot of stuff. And if we can practice things in relationship to what we do, then we're actually beginning to cultivate this internal state in relationship to how we do things in the world.
Awesome.
Very cool.
That's really cool.
All right, we are about out of time. Stephen, thank you. It's a fascinating conversation. So everybody who's listening to this webcast, please go visit Stephen's website at evenpulse.com and We also invite you to visit End of Growth's website, endofgrowth.com, and please join Jim for his podcast on Iron Sharpens Iron movement. So a lot of things going on around leadership and leading in a crisis, and we're just going to continue to be here for you every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And End of Growth also has 2 other podcasts, The Elephant in the Room at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesdays, and The Director's Chair at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursdays. So please join us. And Dr. Jacqueline RJ, thank you for being here again. We greatly appreciate you, and we appreciate you joining us every week. So that's it. So Vera, stay on for after we get off the air, please. So we're going to debrief a little bit. And Stephen, thank you again. And it's very kind of you to join us.
Thank you. My great pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Take care.